Okay, I think we're just gonna start, and we'll get this party started. And in the sake of time, you don't want to keep you guys past your bedtime, right? When Palwasha gets here, we'll make sure we introduce her. So, hello and welcome. Good evening. My name is Bumi Akinasotu. Oh, she's here. She's here. We'll wait. We should start. No, we don't do that. We're not gonna do that.
I should mention also that Palwasha is late, but we are very grateful for her addition. She's a late addition. Kiran Pervez has laryngitis, and so she was on the original announcement, but we have, in fact, upgraded to Palwasha Kakar. So.
Welcome, Palwasha. Thank you for being here. As I was saying, I am the moderator for this evening. My name is Bumi Akinasotu, and you might be wondering who I am. I am the creator and producer of a radio show and podcast called What in the World that attempts to make American foreign policy understandable and relevant to like regular people outside of the Beltway. And all of my guests are women and people of color who are experts in this field. And so it's my passion to make sure regular people understand what in the world is going on out there in a way that's fun and interesting. And I can say, as of yesterday, that I accepted a position to be the chief of staff for the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. So become a member. Yes. Oh, hey. So I'm excited to be here and facilitate this discussion. Before we get to know our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping items. You can turn your phones off, but don't put them too far away because we are tweeting the event. The hashtag is ICRDCVE. If you're following us on Twitter, I don't know where the bathrooms are. They're over here to the right if you need to get to the bathrooms. And I want to thank our sponsors for this wonderful event, the American University Creative Peace Initiative. Folks, thank you for having us, as well as the American University Society for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And thank you to the staff who helped make all of this possible. So why are we here? What's going on? Over the past several years, ICRD has completed a multi-country study on the role of religious actors in CVE, with a focus on identifying good practices for engaging ultra-conservative fundamentalist religious groups who often have a unique capacity to access and influence certain populations that would not have otherwise been receptive to outside voices. And in recent years, there has been an ongoing debate among practitioners and scholars and others in the field, policymakers, about the merits and dangers of working with nonviolent but illiberal religious actors. So while some argue that such an engagement provides these actors with a dangerous public platform, others argue that conservative religious actors are a key entry point for reaching vulnerable populations or vulnerable communities. And I'm going to apologize in advance if my New England accent comes out. It happens when I'm nervous. But so you all this evening are part of this conversation, a part of this debate, and I hope that you'll come away with some useful information or key insights that you can use in your place of work or in your practice or when you go back on the Hill or back to class or wherever you're going after this. So our panelists who will walk us through this conversation are first Dr. Peter Mandeville, who is a professor at the International Affairs in the Scar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. From 2015 and 2016, he served as senior advisor in the Secretary of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department, where he led that office's work on ISIS and sectarian conflict in the Middle East. Ooh.
Oh.
Yeah. I know, right? Ms. Palwasha Kakar, did I say that correctly? Okay, is the Senior Program Officer for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the United States Institute of Peace. Kakhar joined USIP after 4 years with the Asia Foundation, where she was the Afghanistan Director for Women's Empowerment and Development. And last but not least, we have Mr. James Patton, who is the President and CEO of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. That's us, right? This organization. His experience includes assessing the impact of drug policies in Bolivia, training Cambodian Buddhists on post-conflict stability, coordinating citizen security efforts in the Andean regions, training religious actors in countering violent extremism, and leading stability operation assessments for the United States Department in South Sudan. So other just amazing experiences. So just the format for this evening, each panelist will have about 10 minutes to give brief remarks about the topic. I'll have 1 or 2 questions for all of them. And then the show the spotlight is on you all to ask our panelists some questions as well. So first we'll begin with Peter to talk about his thoughts on CEV and engaging these groups.
Great. Thank you very much, Bunmi, and I'm really grateful to ICRD for organizing this and to the folks at AU for hosting us and bringing us together. I want to engage this as the question that it's framed as, including the exclusivists, question mark. And it's a question where I think my own thinking has evolved pretty considerably over the years. And that's another reason why I was very grateful for the invitation, because it sort of gives me the opportunity to kind of think out loud in terms of talking about how that thinking has evolved. And I think the kind of shift that I've gone through, the migration that I've gone through on this, is from being someone who tended to answer this question in a default yes. That absolutely you need to be able to be open to and be willing to engage with anyone, regardless of their persuasion and orientation, in order to be able to make a positive or have a positive impact on conflict, the transformation of conflict, and more specifically the issue that we're here to discuss this evening, violent extremism. And I think my thinking was often informed by a sense that certainly in the realm of, say, U.S. foreign policy, there were certain kinds of actors that were considered default off limits that the government would simply not speak to. This is something that I dealt with firsthand during my time at the State Department, certainly during the period that you were kind enough to mention when I was working on ISIS in 2015 to 2016. But my first taste of it was when I worked as a member of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's policy planning team during the Arab uprising, when my main task that I was handed was to kind of formulate a new U.S. policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood and groups like that. And this was a group that, while not regarded by most analysts as a violent group or an extremist group, was still one where there were sort of certain limits in U.S. policy with regard to the question of whether these groups could be, or should be engaged. And indeed, it's actually the question of engagement with the Brotherhood and the comparison of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood with other forms of Islamism, more specifically militant forms of Islamism, such as Salafi jihadi groups, that brought me kind of directly into the practical implications of this question. And more specifically, some developments in 2005 in the United Kingdom that I both kind of observed and had some small role in, which was a desire on the part of the British government to displace from a well-known mosque in North London, the Finsbury Park Mosque, a Salafi jihadi preacher Sheikh Abu Hamza al-Masri, someone who had been involved in militant activity in Algeria and someone who was speaking and acting and engaged in other activities that the British government had identified as providing support for recruiting people into Al-Qaeda and other Salafi jihadi groups. And so there was a desire to kind of move him out of that mosque. And the British government, and more specifically the London security authorities, decided to do that by building a partnership with a local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK. And the controversy that sprang up around that event, I think, for me, nicely captures the essence of the kind of conundrum that one engaged in this work faces, which was the idea that, on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, as a form of Islamism, represented a politically engaged form of Islam that was openly critical of US, or rather UK government policy towards the Middle East. And in that sense, it had street cred. This wasn't a desire, or this wasn't a plan to kind of hand control of the mosque over to, a group that was apolitical, not engaged, and just, almost overly moderate, if you can use that language. But rather a group that had a very clear political edge to it, but also a group that had been connected in some of its activities with viewpoints and actions that sometimes serve to limit the ability of Muslim communities in the UK to integrate into British society. A group that furthermore was identified in terms of its internal organizations and practices with certain forms of exclusion, particularly with respect to gender, a movement that was very segregated in terms of gender, a group that was certainly not necessarily advocates of women's rights. And so the controversy that sprang up was the idea that by partnering with this group, with the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the local authorities in London were potentially making the decision to trade off kind of short-term security gains against longer-term risks connected to the broader integration of Muslims in societies, and perhaps risks connected to those same local authorities' commitment to things like the rights and empowerment of women, right? And so I think that was my first kind of practical taste of this problem, and that's what kind of started my head scratching, because while I'm not one of those who sees the Muslim Brotherhood as a militant organization. I don't see the group as a terrorist risk. I see it as a fairly mainstream, normalized part of the Muslim political landscape in many countries, and a group that absolutely has to be engaged with. It does raise questions about, a broader calculation that we have to undertake. And so I think where this has sort of shifted me, this kind of calculation becomes even, I think, more complicated when we're talking about groups that you might characterize as being even further to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood. I suspect we'll hear a lot today about the question of whether engaging groups that like the Salafi jihadis are also Salafi in terms of their theological orientation, but either do not have or actively oppose to the use of violence as a way to kind of achieve change. The idea that the fact that they're Salafi makes it possible for them to sort of speak a kind of language and to use a sort of grammar of religious justification that is similar to the ones that the type of language that the militants might use, but to then use that same grammar, use that same conceptual vocabulary to argue against the legitimacy of violence. And maybe that's a powerful tool. Again, very complicated because these are groups that on other issues with respect to society, women, minority groups, even certain forms of Muslim practice take a very hard line. And so I think where that's brought me at the end of the day, as an answer to the question that we're kind of framing this discussion about, is that there is no answer. I guess I've moved from a default kind of, yes, you should engage the exclusivist, to it depends. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And that is going to likely be a very complicated, walking a fine line count of calculus that you will have to decide in real time in often very fluid, on the ground situations where, with often imperfect information, you will have to make the decisions about whether certain kinds of short-term gains are worth trading for the potential of longer-term loss with respect to other kinds of things that we value and care about. So that's just a kind of broad framing of the question as I've thought about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Always hard to follow Peter. Working without any notes, too. Thanks a lot. So my name is James Patton, as was mentioned, and just a brief word about International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. We really work at the intersection of violent conflict and religious identity. And that's not to say that religion is a driver of violent conflict in all of the cases, but really where, social identity has a religious dimension to it that's significant, and where there are violent conflict issues, and religion can either be a driver or a mitigator in that space. We work within the faith tradition of the communities with whom we work. We are not a religious organization ourselves. We're comprised of many different faith traditions and some folks who have none, and really connect with the faith of the folks with whom we're engaging. And when we frame things in terms of faith, it reflects their belief system. So one of our longest standing programs has been a program in the Pakistani madrasas, which I believe started 14 years ago, right around now. The idea was that you have youth coming out of these madrasas who have been memorizing a text that they can't read in their original tongue. They probably don't read that language or even speak the language that the text is in, so the text is being interpreted to them by their teacher. And then they come out into the quote-unquote real world, which is a more diverse, pluralist space, and are not able to really engage with that, and are highly susceptible to recruitment by extremist groups. So the idea there was, if we can get into the training, the teaching, pedagogy, and work around critical thinking skills and tolerance, and work these elements into their education, then their susceptibility to recruitment will go down. Now, this started as a small effort with maybe a couple of dozen people that were engaged, but over time, the buy-in from the Pakistani Madrasa Oversight Board, as well as other elements of the society, and particularly Deobandi and Wahhabi Muslim leaders, started to give breadth to the effort. And over the course of a decade, we reached more than 2,500 madrasa leaders and religious leaders. That number has continued to grow over the last few years as well. They were primarily Deobandi and Wahhabi madrasas that we were working with, and I think this was the early inspiration for ICRD to think about, what does it mean to get conservative religious leaders behind an effort that you're making to transform violent conflict, right? What are the benefits of that and the challenges of that? But what are the potential benefits of that? When I think in terms of how these religious leaders can engage with communities at risk, I have this kind of triangle that I use when I talk about influence, social influence. And so these leaders as social influencers have three things. They have access to the community at risk. They have legitimacy in front of that community, and they have authority over the dialogues and narratives in front of that community as well. So those three pieces really are essential to having broad influence in a community. When we're talking about communities that are at risk of engaging in violence around their ideological beliefs, so fundamentalist beliefs that radicalize to violent action. We're really talking about groups that in many ways are isolated from what we would call the moderates, the mainstream voices. They're physically sometimes isolated from the mainstream voices, but they're also ideologically isolated from them, and certainly dialogically isolated from there, and there's not a lot of interaction there. So I think of things like the Marrakesh Declaration effort, which is a wonderful engagement of many different faith leaders from around the Muslim world and around the world really, coming together to make a statement against religiously driven violence. This is a very important effort, and it's a very important document. It's an important network that was then built. But these are not voices that are reaching communities of youth at risk on the fringes, in peri-urban areas, in underdeveloped communities, in countries that don't have access to this literature, and even if they did have access to this literature, would probably dismiss it because it's not ideologically aligned with their perception of their faith tradition. So this is not ideologically legitimate. It does not have access to these folks largely, and therefore is not influential in the way that we'd like to see people be able to transform ideas, use their influence to transform ideas, to keep the at-risk communities from making that decision to radicalize to active violence. Now, conservative religious communities can also self-isolate. Oftentimes the religious narrative is such that engaging with social or political structures and institutions is counter to the belief system. And that self-isolation then contributes to some of the problems that I've already mentioned. That limits the ability for outsiders to intervene in the first place. Then fundamentalist groups in many cases are criminalized by the police, by the political institutions. That continues to push them to more of an isolated position, which has been shown to, this kind of separation from society and politics has been shown to further put pressure on radicalization, or in favor of radicalization, is a push factor towards radicalization. And finally, the idea that being antagonistic to groups of others just creates a social narrative of division that is, I think, contradictory to some of the inclusive ideologies that are fundamental to Western thinking about society. So really what we're challenged with is this question of how to include the exclusivists, right, in the West. The idea being that in the West, we like to offer the opportunity for all voices to be heard. That's the idea behind our democratic process fundamentally, is voices come equally to the table. All of them are heard, and then the group decides what's the best way to act, to break it down to its fundamental idea. Now, to not bring voices to the table so that they can be heard is one of the things that makes them feel that they are excluded and therefore are not represented and are not in a position to participate or protect the center, so to speak, and the institutions that are there. Having worked with gang members in Latin America for a number of years, I recall being told by gang members who were trying to get out of the gangs, we're expected to abide by the laws of a society that has left us out completely. And so what is our driving motive to protect the center when the center's doing nothing for us? So instead of that, we're forming our own groups to defend ourselves, to create our own rules for belonging, and find our way to survive, right? So these are definitely, the exclusion of these voices in the first place are definite drivers towards conflict. So that being said, the reports that we have in front of us, and I believe they're outside on the table, but we have two reports that ICRD has put out over the last couple of months, one on Yemen and one on Tunisia. We'll be following with the one on Morocco in the next couple of months, and then have recently extended the program to another 4 countries. So over the next couple of years, we hope to do these as a series. These reports are really kind of agnostic on this question, sort of like Peter was saying, on whether or not we should engage with conservative religious actors, ultra-conservative, non-violent, but illiberal religious actors who don't believe in a wide swath of what we do embrace as Western values, but do have this access, legitimacy, and authority that I mentioned. What they do instead is they say, if we were to engage with them, how would it best be done? What is their thinking on countering violent extremism? What is their thinking on the causes of violent extremism? What is their thinking on the role of faith leaders in the community? What is their thinking on the relationship between themselves or other faith leaders and CSOs to the government and to other institutions of the center? So it kind of lays out a roadmap of, again, if we were to connect with these folks, what would that look like, and what are some of the recommendations for how best to do so? Now, I believe I'm closing into my time, but very quickly, so in Yemen and in Tunisia, we engage with well over 100 in each of these places, conservative religious actors and other members of the self-described conservative religious actors. Not all of them would be self-described as Salafis, but again, there are some challenges within those contexts as to how people will describe themselves in any case. So identifying that particularity of their identity is not always that easy. We engage with hundreds of civil society actors as well, and dozens of subject matter experts and other national stakeholders. And found that in both countries, and I would encourage you to read, I can't go too deep into details, but read the reports and would love to hear your feedback. But in both countries, religious actors and civil society leaders felt that religious actors should have a key role in countering violent extremism work. But in both countries, they also felt like they did not, or were not actually living up to that potential role. It's very interesting to hear from faith leaders what seems like a contradictory message, which is they should have a role, they don't have a role, but then the government is primarily responsible for countering violent extremism work. Particularly interesting in a place like Yemen, where the government is effectively collapsed and over many years has not been able to act on behalf of the local communities and CVE in any regard, and yet they are still looking to the government as the primary actor in this space. One of the things that they agreed on was that the state doesn't always provide a very clear role for faith leaders. So there's a breakdown in communication, but there's also a breakdown in practical implementation and relationships around doing CVE together in an inclusive manner. And in both countries, it was almost universal that people felt like religious actors could get more formalized training, both in the religious in the religious sector and religious knowledge, but also in these questions of acting as a civil society actor and working on countering violent extremism work. Neither country saw an important role for religious actors in bridging the government with civil society, which was also very interesting since they saw the government as important in CVE and their own role as important in CVE. So you can see some of the contradictions that are coming out in people's thinking, which from my point of view is good in a way because it allows for subsequent intervention in these spaces to try to tease out some of these questions and help them sort of map what the realities of the implications of these things are. In Yemen in particular, again, some of these were the same as were found in Tunisia, but they felt CSO actors, civil society actors, felt like religious actors were extremely influential at the local level, but found them to be corrupted and politically biased, which was interesting because the religious actors themselves held themselves in very high regard when it came to the questions of corruption and political bias, and tagged corruption as, in both countries actually, as one of the primary drivers of CVE. The other thing in Yemen that I found really interesting is that most of the respondents felt that the primary drivers of violent extremism came from abroad. They didn't have to do with religious knowledge or political identity or identity conflicts internally, but they had to do with things like NATO imposing their interests on the local communities in a way that drove violent extremism. a conclusion from that for action and intervention would be local ownership is incredibly important. And outside actors and interveners will have a very difficult time doing work on the ground as such because of this deep suspicion of outsiders in the CVE framework. In Tunisia, Tunisia really, in the post-Arab Spring period, had a proliferation of different religious voices in a space that had been very controlled by the government. And that allowed for Salafi voices to really take an outsized role in the community. And then the center, so to speak, the social center as well as the political center, tried to crack down and limit that again, and has set up this very antagonistic framework now. When we were there talking to political leaders, for example, they said they couldn't even talk about bridging the gap between the political sector and the Salafis because they would lose their jobs. They would be kicked out of office. It was a taboo subject for them. So to be even able to discuss creating a middle ground now is difficult in that space. So of course, part of the recommendations that we conclude are that needs to be done. There needs to be a middle ground. There needs to be a bridging function. Those voices need to be able to be heard, again, in order to be legitimized to a degree so they don't feel deeper and deeper exclusion. And that the Salafi community feels like this is a question of human rights. So any engagement with the Salafi community on this question really should be framed around a human rights lens, which would also tend to bring in some of the more liberal center of the political and social sphere. So I'll leave it at that, but there are quite a few other conclusions and recommendations that I would encourage you to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulasha.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Paulasha Kakar, and I work as was mentioned in the United States Institute of Peace on the Religion and Inclusive Societies team. Just to give you a quick little background about the U.S. Institute of Peace, it was established in 1984 by Congress as an academy for peace building, and it has sort of two arms, both the teaching side and also the research and the piloting side. The religion program was started in the 1990s, so way before any talk about countering violent extremism or this kind of terrorism. But really it was looking at the intersection of religion and peace building, both as a driver and as a resource. So as a driver for conflict and as a resource for peace building. And so out of that, we've evolved to not only do research, but also to pilot programs in this area. Because we've sort of talked about how there's this thin line to walk, as Peter mentioned, or there's these two minds. I myself am of two minds, and as I was thinking about this, one of the prayers of Moses in the Quran came to mind that I'd like to begin with, and many imams begin with this prayer when they begin to speak or give a sermon. It is Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yusir li amri, which means, my Lord, put assurance in my heart and make the task easy for me. وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي وَيَفْقَهُ قَوْلِي. And that is to untie the knot from my tongue so that I may be understood. And I think particularly here, because there is this two minds in me, both that, yes, we should engage, but no, we shouldn't. This is something I've been struggling with in terms of how to articulate this tension between the both. And so I like to give a little bit of a background in terms of my own work and where I struggled to see these issues. First of all, the work that I did in Libya in terms of mapping the religious sector was from 2014 to 2016, and that was a period of turmoil in Libya. And we saw this huge drastic change happen in terms of how the quietist Salafis changed their behavior. So in the beginning, in 2011 to 2014, the quietist Salafis were known as the ones that were told to stay at home, to not participate in demonstrations, to not participate in political processes, to not come out on the streets. And so they were at home. And there was this big tension because a lot of the revolutionaries are saying, oh, you need to get up, you need to come out of your homes, you need to demonstrate and to do something. But the quietist Salafis, most known as the Mudkhalis, were staying at home. And this was because of a number of different fatwas that were issued, both from the Mudkhali or Jami leaders from Saudi Arabia, but also some of the later on fatwas were issued by the Grand Mufti Ghiriani in Libya as well. But this shifted, and so as from 2014, soon after 2014, when Parliament was attacked, and the GNC government wasn't turning over power to the newly elected Parliament, this is when things started to shift. And this is when there was a call to arms for these quietists to actually go out and to take up arms and to violently respond to the ills that they saw around them. And so what was interesting was that there were mudkhalis on both sides of the conflict. There were mudkhalis both on the side of the GNC, the parliament that wasn't giving up the government, and they were on the side of the HOR or on Haftar's side. And they were both they both went to arms. And so here we were thinking, well, the quietist Salafis, surely they're not the ones that are going to pick up arms. Surely they're the ones that are going to stay nonviolent, but they didn't. And so that raised a lot of alarms, particularly in those of us that were following this and thinking about engaging more with the quietist Salafis, that there was a slippery slope and that they would pick up arms based on their beliefs and who was giving the fatwas. And that came in contrast to my own experience in Afghanistan. Now, I had worked in Afghanistan prior to joining USIP for 10 years. And I had noticed a lot of very interesting factors there that in programs where we were trying to engage with religious leaders who supported the government, were known as the dollar mullahs or the government-supported mullahs, and they didn't have any credibility. So it was really difficult to do any kind of outreach with those kinds of, with the mullahs who really were seen as part of the government or arms of the government. And so it was important to find ways to engage with those religious leaders who were on the fringes, who were not associated with the government, who maybe spoke out against the government in many ways. And so there were programs that I had observed where religious leaders were taken on exposure visits to, some of these very conservative religious leaders were taken on exposure visits to other places. They went to Deoband to meet with the Deobandi leaders. They went to Azhar, they went to Malaysia, they went to other countries. And this really seemed to open up their perspectives on how they thought about the government, how they thought about violence, how they thought about extremism. And this leads me then to the point that right now USIP's research is finding. USIP has been working on, the Afghanistan team particularly, has been working on looking at what are the best ways to engage on countering violent extremism. And what they've noticed is in mapping the stakeholders, the conservative religious leaders are often left out of the conversation. And those are the ones that are often the credible voices, the ones that the people that we really want to reach are that have the street cred, as Peter mentioned, that aren't being brought in. And so the research is really showing that those that are paid by the government are not popular and they're not trusted. So how do you bring in those that are seen more on the fringes but maybe are not violent? And so far, what the research has said is that there are ways to engage in conversations and dialogue that are asking them about what they think and how they view, for example, the International Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights, and really exposing them to a variety of different ideas within Islamic thought. So there's something called the Shamla electronic library that's also been used as a tool to sort of expose them to different ideas. And that seems to move perspectives on tolerance and also bring about more of the ethics of disagreement that really allows that kind of dialogue to happen and that tolerance at some level to happen. So there can be conservative views, but then there's still tolerance, which is one of the key issues in bringing in conservative voices, is being able to have that kind of space for dialogue. So I just wanted to end with a few examples of how, at the local level, at the very, very local level, the community level, how some women, particularly those who have religious training, have been able to engage with violent extremists for particular ends in their community. One of these stories I came across was actually early on in 2010, where women from Paktia, this is the eastern part of Afghanistan, which is very conservative and also very tribal, had explained that when the Taliban came to their area, they wanted to immediately shut down the girls' school. And these women decided that they were going to go and negotiate with the Taliban on this issue. And there were two of these women who had also recognition in the community for being jirgamars. That means women who participate in the jirgas, or the shura councils, to make decisions at the local level. And they negotiated, really starting with religious reasoning, talking about how the importance of education for girls and boys is equal from a religious perspective, and worked their way into understanding what the concerns were from the Taliban perspective at that point. And basically the Taliban said, well, there has to be Islamic curriculum. They said, okay, there's going to be Islamic curriculum. We're teaching Islam in the courses, and then also that there can be no men. And they said, of course, and there should be prayer spaces in the building, the school building, of course. So those things were all negotiated, and they were able to keep the girls' school open in their area in Paktia. Similarly, there was an example of a woman who was a Quran teacher, and in her community in Helmand, in the southern province, parents asked her to go find their daughter. And what had happened was their daughter had eloped with her lover and was lost, and the Taliban had basically captured them. And the parents were terrified that the Taliban would kill their daughter, and so asked this woman to go and find her and talk to the Taliban about this. And she did. She went and found the Taliban, asked them to take her to this girl, and the Taliban transferred her to different stations until she actually went across the border into Pakistan, where they were holding this young woman. And it was within the day that she had left the house, so the night had not happened where she was alone. And she stayed with this girl and convinced the Taliban, again, very much talking about using religion, the importance of religion, the importance of forgiveness, how the parents wanted her back, also using traditional Pashtun Wali concepts to convince the Taliban to release her and not to stone this girl, which would have been their imperative from their religious perspective. And through that, telling them, calling them sons and telling them that this isn't the right kind of behavior for them, convinced them that this wasn't the path that they should take, but that they should release this girl to her and let her take her home to her parents. And she was successful in doing this. There are countless stories like this where women at the local level have been able to, using very conservative religious language, very much male-centered language, language that is traditional, sometimes shaming as well at the local level, to be able to use that kind of language with violent extremists to stop them from committing a violent act and to change and deviate from their path. And so I think this really shows the importance that we do need to engage. We do need to engage at different levels, but how we engage, how we carefully walk this path is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Palwasha. And I actually want to pick up with you with that amazing narrative that you shared. So these women, I don't know them, obviously, but they were fighting for their lives, and particularly in the last situation. So do you think there's anything from a practitioner's perspective we can learn from these women? Because we are here in this wonderful institution, and we've all got great degrees and have studied all around the world. But these women are in this moment and were able to pull some tools to get themselves out of really tough situations. So are there any sort of nuggets that you think we can apply if we decide to go out and do these sort of face-to-face conversation with extremist groups, as we're calling them?
Well, I think as James mentioned, it's and also Peter both, it's that it's using the right kind of language and framing it within the right kind of language. So if you're not from within that faith tradition, being very honest about the faith tradition that you're coming from and presenting that. So faith to faith is also very important. But in terms of, this is something that we struggle with a lot in terms of how is this scalable? Is this how do we do this and make it applicable? And what I am proposing to study is actually to understand what are the arguments that they're using, how are they using these arguments, how are these tools successful in different contexts, because it's not just in Afghanistan. We're seeing women in Syria using similar tools and tactics, and that are able to get the release of hostages and able to get safe passage and all kinds of things like that. We're seeing there are examples of women in Colombia who were able to do similar kinds of negotiation, particularly the nuns in Colombia who were able to negotiate with the FARC. There are examples in Libya, in Nigeria, they're all around the world. There are examples of women at the local level being able to do this. And to understand those tools, I think, first of all, they're very context specific. There are some overarching, like I was saying, using religious language, using cultural language, shaming, endearing, those kinds of things are there. But some of the tools, I think, are very specific. And so it's a piece that we really struggle with, is how do we scale that up, or how do we move from that? And that's something that I'd like to study a lot more, in a lot more detail, yeah.
Thank you. And I actually want to go back to something that you talked about, Peter, which was very helpful in sort of defining, extremists. What is an extremist? And I struggled in reading some of the work that this is something that we, as Westerners, right, are placing on others. And so, do these groups sort of see themselves as extremists, or are they just sort of seeing themselves as, we're just trying to maintain our religious values, our community? So how do they see themselves in this context? And is that important as we do this work, knowing that this is sort of an imposed title, right, on these groups?
Yeah, well, I think that with respect to the question of the kind of values that these groups see themselves as embracing and trying to promote, when it comes to religion specifically, and when I'm thinking of Salafi groups in particular, I certainly don't think that they see these views as extreme. For Salafis understand themselves to be an expression of the most authentic form of their religion. I mean, one of the kind of hallmark characteristics of Salafism as a form of theology, and more specifically as a form of jurisprudence in Islamic law, is that whereas in generic Sunni Islam, as it's broadly practiced throughout the world, there's a recognition that there are sort of 4 broadly accepted schools of legal thought, and they have different areas of emphasis and slightly different methodologies, but they're all valid. Whereas Salafis reject the idea that there are different schools of thought. There is Islam. There's the correct way of doing it or the wrong way of doing it. And they don't see that as an extreme point of view. They just see that as the correct understanding and practice of their religion. I think that there are expressions of this kind of ideology that is avowedly radical as distinct from extreme. And to me, there is a difference there.
That's a difference,
To me, when I think of political radicalism, I think of a group that is avowedly rejecting the political status quo. Right? It is saying that the prevailing political arrangements, political system is illegitimate, and so I need to change that. Right? Not sort of work within it to achieve what I want, but to actually overthrow it in some sense. Right, and so, that's I think an important distinction to make, because as you recognized, right, the term itself, extreme, is very relative. So I just get allergic to anytime I hear extreme or moderate, those terms. Talk about moderate Islam, moderate Muslims. Well, what does that mean? Right, moderation and extremity are simply expressions of degree. There's no actual content to that. So if the thing we don't, if what we're worried about is violence, then call it what you're worried about. If you're worried about exclusionary politics, anti-women views, call it that. Because terms like extreme and moderate just don't really get us very far.
Right, but I think from a policy perspective, we probably need a target, right? So having a category of moderates or extremists sort of help policymakers in particular identify the enemy, right?
Right, and so I think, so for policymakers, the challenge comes in, because policymakers are by their nature utilitarian. They're instrumentalists. They're trying to get things done and achieve certain kinds of outcomes, and there's then a recognition that maybe you need to talk to and work with some of these people in order to get that done. So I think the challenge then becomes, how do you engage without endorsing?
Right.
Right,
Right.
that becomes the
Right.
key challenge.
And James, I want to pick up on something that you talked about, which was really interesting to me as well, which is sort of the views that many of the folks that it's really the outsiders, right, are the cause of all of this stuff, the NATOs and maybe World Banks or whatever, right? That's the problem. So from your perspective, how do you combat that if you're sort of an organization like your own, where you're engaging these groups? Like, you're an outsider. They already see you sort of as this, as the reason for all of these problems. So how do you equip yourself, your team, your allies on the ground to make sure that you get what you need to get done or accomplish your goal?
Well, and I just want to quickly second what Peter was saying. I don't think there are many religious people who like the term moderate, right? Because, I mean, folks are passionate about their faith.
Right.
And the idea that you have a moderate faith doesn't really sound that flattering. But you ask a very good question. I mean, and it's not just in places like Yemen where it's perceived that the problem is coming from abroad. It's in a lot of our work where any kind of perception that an outsider is meddling is also problematic. I mean, these are people's belief systems, their lives, their communities, and for someone else to come into that and tell them how better to do whatever it might be is fundamentally a problem. And it's also not our modus operandi, right, is going in and with a paternalistic lens telling folks on the ground in other countries who they should be. What we do is a number of things. I mean, one of our primary functions in our work, and this is not true of all of our programs, but it's true of a wide majority of them, is a training of trainers function. And so we bring to a set of folks from the community itself or from the context itself certain skills that then they can transfer into their own communities, right? So that puts us a little bit more at a distance. We have a buffer between us and the ultimate beneficiaries of whatever we're doing. Now, how do we determine what it is that they quote unquote need to have? Our approaches are very elucidative in that regard. I mean, there are certain things that we do create modules around certain concepts. So if it's conflict resolution, for example, there are certain practices that you can bring to folks about conflict analysis, about engaging in certain kinds of dialogues, et cetera. But all of our programming elicits from participants, how they analyze their own community. Effectively, I consider ICRD to be a facilitation organization in many regards, which is to say we facilitate the dialogues that then elicit this information and unearth this information. Then we facilitate the process by which that can be sort of strategically laid out. So a lot of what we bring oftentimes is kind of the ability to strategically think through these different variables that the folks on the ground themselves have identified and help them structure that in a way that then they can devise programming ideas, and those programming ideas can be more effective. And then we can facilitate the access to resources, whether those are financial resources or relational resources. I don't know if you're familiar with John Paul Lederach. He's a Mennonite peacemaker, and he talks about a middle-out function that can be played by organizations that can work across a base, which is to say across a community, to bring them together and help them develop from their own understanding of the context, ideas of what to do about their expressed problems, but also a bottom-up or top-down relationship that can be facilitated where the base can then talk to power elite or economic elite that they otherwise never would have been in the room with. And so in many ways, we try to play that middle out or facilitating role in a lot of the spaces that we go into.
Thank you, thank you. And we're going to turn it over to the audience in just a second, but before I do, I want to ask just across the panel, and James, you raised this, talking about Latin America and the work that you've done, and Pawasha, you mentioned this as well, but I kept thinking about the United States, right, and some of the stuff that we're dealing with here, in terms of the alt-right, and I don't, maybe call it extreme left, I don't know, but do you think that there are lessons that we can draw from your experiences abroad with any of these groups? Do you think there are lessons that we can draw from here in the United States and learn from and apply and be successful?
I just quickly interject on that, if you don't mind. We brought together American evangelical pastors, megachurch pastors, and a couple of American Muslims, and one poor solitary Jewish woman, together with Deobandi and Wahhabi imams from Pakistan and a couple of Christian Pakistanis, to talk about how do you protect religious minorities in one another's context, in your own context, because the concerns on the Pakistani side were Islamophobia in the United States and the persecution of Muslims, and the concerns for the Christian Americans were persecution of Christians in Pakistan. What happens in the United States has a profound and direct effect on what happens abroad. The treatment of religious minorities, particularly in this case of Muslims in the United States, feeds directly into violent extremist narratives in a lot of these spaces. And so what part and parcel of our programming work is a small program, a nascent program on countering Islamophobia, which we hope to expand to work on religious prejudice as a whole, because religious prejudice is not a new thing for the United States, prejudice in general. But the idea that we need to be introspective and take seriously our own challenges, I think, is critical, because it not only allows us to understand better how other people are thinking and seeing us and their relationship with us, it adds legitimacy to us when we go abroad and talk about other people's challenges.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Pawasha, what about you?
I think for us, it's a difficult question to answer, because USIP is focused internationally and not internally, and sort of it's our mandate that we don't focus things internally. But at the same time, as we engage internationally, we do get a lot of questions in terms of, what's happening in the United States and how do you understand that? And we, in our work, are just very honest about, it's a challenge here and it's a challenge there. There are challenges all in all parts of the world, and we have to be honest about where we're coming from. And like James was saying, that brings that kind of integrity and legitimacy to the work, saying that we're all, struggling with very similar ideas and issues across the board.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I think there are things going on in this country right now that necessarily lead us to have to ask these questions in our own communities and society right now. So at one level, no, I don't want to engage with the guys marching in Charlottesville in order to be able to maybe have a different kind of conversation with the white supremacist militias. I do not want to enable that. There's been enough enabling of that, and so I don't want to be part of that. And so I think this is something that we're actually being confronted with very directly in our backyard, and so need to kind of figure out how to work through. And that first example I just gave, I think, is a particularly tricky one. But there are other versions of it where I think there is the possibility of progress, and that's where, given the climate around Muslims and Islam in the United States right now, and some of the concerns that have been coming out about Islam centered in, communities of the political and religious right in the United States, I actually think that there's really interesting work to be done in the form of a conservative to conservative dialogue about there. There's been a lot of interest in sort of trying to create spaces of dialogue, and they tend to be fostered and animated by very well-meaning liberals, and that's great, but we don't need liberals as the mediator of this conversation. I want conservative evangelicals in this country to sit down with Salafis and have a conversation, because I think they'll realize very quickly that they have an enormous amount in common at a very basic level, and then move forward from there.
That would be a powerful thing to see happen in the United States. I know I'm a member of the New Bethel Baptist Church here in Washington, and we've sat down with other sort of similarly faithed Baptist churches and have had conversations about how here in Washington, D.C., we're right across the street from each other. One church is white, one church is black. And on Sundays, you can definitely see the crowds go their separate ways, right? And so it's definitely a conversation we need to have here at home. But we have probably about 15 minutes or so. So, just one moment very quickly. So asking the questions, we have someone with a mic, correct? Okay. All right. Just tell us your name and your affiliation if you choose. And for the sake of our colleagues in the room, who, what, when, where, why, how questions, and keep it brief, and feel free, of course, to direct your question to any member of our panel. So.
And Bunmi, we started about 15 minutes late, so I'm perfectly willing to stick around for an extra
perfect.
15 minutes. I don't know if you all are. But.
Yeah, okay, let the party continue. All right. So we have a question here up at the front, and then we'll work our way this way.
First, let me congratulate the panel on your very insightful inputs. Found it very enlightening. I have an observation and a question to pose. The observation builds on what you were talking about, Paul Washa, and that is that when ICRD first began its work in Pakistan, it was working with the leaders of the male madrasas, and the female leaders of the girls' madrasas wanted similar treatment. But the men would have nothing to do with that, so we didn't do it. But after 3 years, the men asked, so I guess pillow talk had carried the day. And so the center took on the female madrasas, and as you might imagine, the women get it twice as fast as the men do. But the reason I raise this, because it's so relevant to what you're talking about here, is that why it was so important to get to the women is that before these children reach madrasa age, as in many cultures, the women have a monopoly on their existence, their growth, their being. And the women tend to be arch-conservative because they have to be sort of purer than Caesar's wife with respect to religious scruples and the rest of it. So once they started coming around, then you find that working with the kids and the teachers and all makes it goes a lot faster. The question I have, Peter, relates to your earlier incarnation at State when you were on policy planning staff. When the Brotherhood took over in Egypt, the United States, the Obama administration, tried to be forthcoming and talked about willingness to engage and to recognize their legitimacy and the rest. And after that, I had a sensing that our government started retrenching a bit, even before Morsi was deposed. And I'm just wondering, A, is that true? And if it is true, was it because we perceived that Morsi was not being as inclusive as he needed to be to carry the day?
You know, Doug, my sense is that, and is amidst all of the chatter from 2011 to 2013 about kind of how the U.S. was aligned vis-a-vis Egypt and whose side we were on. Were we working with the military in that country? Had we struck some deal with the Brotherhood? Were we firmly behind the revolutionary forces, the civil society groups that toppled Hosni Mubarak? What side were we on? And at any point you would hear a thickly laid out conspiracy theory about where we were. I actually think that, and this is the shame of it, from my point of view, is that U.S. policy was absolutely consistent, and that is that it never changed. It never changed from even the policy we had under Hosni Mubarak. U.S. policy from 1979 to this very moment with respect to Egypt has not varied in any meaningful sense. And it is the following. So long as Egypt provides the basic forms of security cooperation that the United States needs, the United States will not say much about what's going on domestically in Egypt. There is plenty we could have said about what was going on under the period of SCAF rule right after the revolution in 2011. There was plenty we could have said about human rights and democracy under Mohamed Morsi, and God knows there's plenty we could be saying right now about what's going on in that country under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. But across all three of those administrations, Washington's calculus was, oh, these guys are giving us what we need, and so, you know, we're not going to rock the boat too much. Yes, there was, I think, sort of some modulation of the calculus with respect to Mohamed Morsi once he became a deeply polarizing force. I don't think that that was evidence of some sort of renewed American ideological aversion towards Islamism. It was more driven by the fact that that region more broadly at that point was catching fire again. Right? The promise of the Arab uprisings had turned into a series of brewing civil wars and instability, and in the face of that instability, our instinct was to move back to what we were comfortable with, and that is a very close relationship with the country's military, meaning that when they undertook that coup, at the time, me and my colleagues at State had to refer to it as the coup-like event, because we weren't allowed to actually call it a coup. When the coup-like event happened in 2013, the basic truth is that the United States didn't really worry too much. But it also meant that we ended up at some level underwriting the single greatest act of mass violence undertaken by the Egyptian state in the modern era, when the Central Security Forces of Egypt killed 1,000 protesters, supporters of Mohamed Morsi in the Rabaa al-Adawiya Square in August 2013.
Thank you. We have a question over here. Oh, we'll go here and then here. Sorry, here. Sorry, right here.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm here from Georgetown University. My question is, tonight I think we've talked a lot about conservative Muslim religious leaders and how best to include these individuals in conversations about peace building. And I'd like to pose this question to all the panelists. To the best of your knowledge, do CVE interventions exist in non-Muslim majority countries? And is a focus on Islam in particular a tenet of the CVE agenda?
Would you like to start, Alasha?
Sure. Yes. So at USIP, we work not only in Muslim countries. We do work in Myanmar. We worked in Sri Lanka with Buddhist extremists, in Nigeria with Christian extremists, as well as, I don't know, we want to say extremists. I don't know if we want to say extremists, but let's say with conservative groups on all sides. But yeah, we try to look at it as a religious phenomenon across different religions. And when we do have our learnings, our seminars, our discussions, we try and do it across the board. So we're not only focusing on Muslim countries where there's violent extremism, but we're also looking at places where there's extremism from Buddhist perspectives, extremism from Christian perspectives as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's undeniable, unfortunately, that CVE either has an explicit or implicit bias toward Muslim extremists. And it's not implicit anymore, it's explicit in terms of the current administration changing the name of countering violent extremism to countering Islamic extremism. That being said, I think that, you know, I mentioned one of the programs we had earlier where we brought together conservative Christians with conservative Muslims to talk about protecting religious minorities. We work in Colombia as well on violence issues there, which I can consider violent extremism as well as political extremism. So for us, we have a broader lens, but I do think that the lens could continue to be broadened, and I think it's a conversation that needs to be sustained so that we don't allow for this either inadvertent or intentional linkage between violent extremism and the Islamic faith.
So I'm in full disclosure, I'm an adamant foe of CVE, just the entire policy paradigm and the way of thinking. And part of my concern about it is it's this sort of weird euphemistic way of of being unwilling to talk about what it's actually about. Because even though the official policy adopted by the administration in which I served framed itself in terms that claimed that it was open to manifestations of extremism that emanate from any range of ideologies, certainly while I was in government, I did not see a single dollar spent on a CVE program that was not focused on Salafi jihadi groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those kinds of groups. Extremist groups defined in reference to Islam specifically. I think USIP deserves actually some really special credit here. It's and I hope Palwasha won't mind me characterizing it this way. I think USIP is an organization that has brilliantly navigated the landscape of CVE in the sense of being an organization that has an agonistic relationship with that space. Recognizing that the rise of the CVE paradigm provides certain kinds of opportunities to be able to work on issues in certain ways, but the beauty of it in the case is that USIP was doing this stuff long before there was CVE, and it was doing it in a very equal opportunity way all over the world. So there, Palwasha has some really unique colleagues that as she said, have been working on these issues in regions where the extremists in question come from very different religious traditions or ideological backgrounds. The Trump administration has not actually changed the title of it to Countering Islamic Extremism. There was talk about doing that. And there was as my in-government moles tell me, there was a very vociferous policy debate about it. They actually really talked through it. And the groups that were against changing the name or changing it to Countering Islamic Extremism or putting Islam into the name actually won the day. They prevailed even in this policy environment. So what the Trump administration has done is to kind of stop talking about CVE. They don't like that terminology anymore. So what they do is they now call it preventing terrorism. So for the Trump administration, it's a dichotomy between countering terrorism and preventing terrorism. And I got to say, again, I don't have a lot of positive things to say about this particular administration myself, but I'm okay with preventing terrorism, just because I know what that is. I'm able to recognize that as a particular set of militant tactics, and so I think we're actually being a little bit more useful in our definitional framing with that language than CVE ever was, frankly.
It just becomes maybe a matter of how you prevent, right? I think that's where we'll start to see sort of differences in policy between previous administrations and this administration is how exactly are you preventing?
That will indeed be very interesting to see, and they have not really had much to say about that. And as I understand it, there is not any brand new preventing terrorism strategy in the office. It's bogged down. Right. They're not moving forward on it.
Well, if I might add, also a lot of this comes to imperfect definitions and word use and imperfect acronyms. And I've seen within the government and outside, people spend a lot of time debating about an acronym where they haven't actually changed their thinking at all, right? But this administration's refusal to recognize white supremacist groups, for example, as on par with other terrorist groups, I think is an indication of what the thinking is behind even some of the new phraseology. So I think it's important to recognize, not just how it's done, but what's really behind the language that's being used.
Absolutely. We had a question up front here as well. Did you still have one? All right. Right here. Oh, no, right here, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Ashwaiter. I'm an AU alumni from law school. I'm from Yemen. As sharing my short experience as a former imam in Yemen, I totally share the same hesitation as involving imams in a lot of issues, and at the same time, it shows that they work well to change different social behavior toward women, a lot of things, but at the same time, empowering imams can also lead to a lot of, bad ending. And I realized that from engaging with different workshop and training for several imams, they become more moderate and adopting, advocating for a lot of democracy values and women's rights and children's rights. However, one point in several NGOs who've been working in that, been dealing with the same imams as is easy and not extending the map for the conservative groups, and it's become like a corruption in that. So the same imams with the same NGOs, when whatever they want to do in a workshop, we have the same list working with the same stuff. Other point, I'm just thinking of a longer term of changing the conservative or I would say the radical for long term, because all these groups, Muslim groups, I would say in Yemen at least, they are sharing the same jurisprudence. So they're coming almost the same jurisprudence. So most of the time, these programs, they're for 1 year or 2 years program. If we need a real deep change in the way how the CVE groups attitude, we need, I guess, a long-term program that's dig to the jurisprudence and, have longer, plan. Finally, my question is you mentioned how in Egypt, dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood, how do you see what's UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have, especially in Yemen, they create a long list, an open list for adding people as a tourist blacklist, list. So they put a lot of Islamic figures and Islamic groups as a tourist, figure. And this came after their conflict with Qatar. And so the lose of tourist term, putting it for a political, agenda, how that affects, CVE. Thank you.
I actually really like your point about the long-term strategy here, because I think that's, the determining factor of how successful, and Paul Washa, you were talking about scaling up, right? Like, we want to see that long-term, that these practices, these strategies, these engagements last beyond, a year or two, and when the foreigners leave, that everybody feels like they have the tools. So how do we ensure that long-term these strategies work?
So, we've been engaging on different kinds of peace curriculum, where particularly, for example, with the Buddhists, we're working on where the monks are being trained to develop peace curriculum with the Buddhist monks so that they have a peace curriculum to train them in Myanmar. Similarly, in Afghanistan, that was another. They were working with religious leaders to work on developing a curriculum that they piloted a number of provinces. Our Afghanistan team piloted a number of provinces. So it's looking at really, changing how things are being taught at that level. And ICRT, of course, has worked in this quite a bit as well. The question, though, still remains, like you were saying, like in larger jurisprudence, it's there. And what I've seen from the years that I've worked in Afghanistan, where majority of the work that I did for the last 5 years with the Asia Foundation was precisely in engaging with the ulama councils, with the imams at the grassroots level on very contentious and sensitive issues related to women's rights. What really changed the perspective was not having the books and the madrasa teaching, but it was exposing them to lots of different ideas. It was them having access to the library of the electronic library, where first they thought, oh, computers are bad, and then we showed them, well, actually you can insert the Shimla package, and it has this electronic library, and you can access all these resources. And all of a sudden, it just opened all these doors for them to do very quick research on specific topics, and they were able to see multiple different perspectives on it that were from sources that they trusted. And that changed quite drastically. It changed people's perspectives, the imams' perspectives. What you were saying in terms of how we continue to work with the same imams that we train, and what I was mentioning earlier is how there's the dollar mullahs, or the government-owned mullahs in Afghanistan. That tends to be a problem. And what we've also noticed is that even when ulama councils have changed their own perspective over time, some groups will target them. So in Kandahar, out of the 22 members of the Ulama Council, 19 of them were killed by the Taliban at the time that I was working there because they had perspectives that were supportive of the government, that were supportive of women's rights. Not necessarily that they were directly supported by the government, but because they had those perspectives. So yeah, I think there's still a very big tension, and how do we work with religious leaders who have legitimacy, but at the same time work with them on some of these issues of tolerance and particularly dialogue. Not necessarily saying you have to change your belief, but be open to sitting in the same room and having conversations with people that you disagree with.
So I just want to raise an interesting statistic, which is in Yemen, Al-Qaeda affiliated group, we studied their Twitter feed, or part of our study looked at the Twitter feed, and over 50% of their tweets were about social issues, and less than 5% were about jurisprudence. Yeah. So they understand that a lot of what's driving a lot of what's allowing them to have an operating space are social issues, and not necessarily religious jurisprudence issues. That being said, we did conflict resolution trainings with religious and civil society leaders there, where they mapped conflict issues and then came up with their own programming to resolve those conflict issues, and were able to do programs in the communities that they had previously allowed the militant groups to come in and do because the government wasn't doing them. So it was this sense of a lack of empowerment on the ground, and either turning to the government for action, law and order, or conflict resolution, or social projects, and instead recognizing that they themselves had the capacity to do these things. And that was the feedback we got from them after they did this, was that they no longer felt the need to allow the militant groups to come in because they felt like they could resolve their problems on their own. So I don't think that rises to the level of Islamic jurisprudence. I think it's more just about natural conflicts between communities.
One of the great problems of CVE has been the creation of a sort of CVE economy, which has incentivized a great number of actors who are looking for quick hits of money to kind of raise their hand and say, "Oh, those militants, I know how to get those guys. Just I need like maybe $500,000, maybe 800,000, and I can do that for you for 6 months." Right? These people have no idea what they're doing. They're the exact opposite of the ICRDs and the USIPs, which distinguish themselves because they understand the deeper societal dynamics at work, and they invest in the areas that they work in for years and years and years. That's something different from the combination of an administration. Wow, I'm really banging on the administration I served in. But a lot of CVE was about a desire to be seen to be doing something in the face of ISIS. And oh my God, CVE, we'll do CVE. We'll throw some money here and throw some money there, and we're doing something. But no one has CVE metrics. No one has any way to effectively monitor and evaluate CVE. There are those who are working on it. People who actually care about doing these programs well are trying to develop metrics that would allow you to say, oh, we're making progress, or we're not. But we're not actually there yet, and I think there's a lot of that kind of problem. You also raised the issue of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and their role in all of this. I think it's an incredibly toxic environment in the region right now, that everyone, there's no single point of blame here. Like, everyone has to blame something, shares of this blame. I personally put more of it on the sort of Saudi Emirati side of the axis, the Emiratis in particular. And I think there's a very specific sort of point in relation to the topic we're discussing. The Emiratis set up a counter-ISIS CVE messaging center some years back, with the idea that they're going to be a regionally based center that will be putting out messages, including religious messages, that will counter the narrative of ISIS and groups like it. But when you look at the list of religious scholars that were approved to be included in their messaging, it's this incredibly narrow list of people who are all the sort of pet transnational neo-traditionalist Sufi friends funded by the Emirati government. Any religious scholar with any historical association with the Ikhwan, or a slightly more politicized understanding of religion, whose voices would be more credible was excluded from the list because that government had made a geopolitical decision to exclude and go after that movement. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia has recently made this rather cryptic announcement that he's going to return Saudi Arabia to moderate Islam. So the chattering classes are all wondering, ooh, moderate Islam, Saudi Arabia's going back to moderate. It sort of suggests that at some point there was moderate Islam in Saudi Arabia, and he's going to go back to it. And I sat down with one of his religious appointees a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League. We sat together for 3 hours, talking through this, and I'm trying to get an answer out of him about what the Saudi Arabia's return to moderate Islam looked like, and all he could give me was CVE talking points. And no sort of thoughtful response. I was, because it's an intriguing concept, but I don't actually think that they've thought through it beyond a set of CVE talking points, frankly.
Wow, that's a lot. I want to pick up on something you mentioned, but I'll see if are there questions in the back anywhere. If we have a question back here, and then we'll come over to the front.
Kamran Bukhari, Center for Global Policy. And this is for everybody. I like the title, but I have a question about including. Including in what? And because I do work in this space, to me it seems like including in the mainstream. And so if the mainstream is up for grabs, there's no well-defined mainstream in these societies. It is a contested space. So we have the problem of the exclusivists, but then we also have the problem of where to bring them into. I mean, there was the report that the Taliban will become a political party soon, and I'm saying, well, the ones that were doing jihad in the 80s, they have yet to become political parties. How are we going to get the Taliban? The point is that there is no mainstream to bring these people into. I'd love for you guys to comment on that.
That's a great question.
Really interesting.
What are we including them into? What are we
It's
including
a
them
very good
into?
question. I guess my assumption was including them in peace processes, and because that's the framework from which I'm looking at it, and making sure that they're part of the conversation around the table, because they all have stakes in it. I mean, just by being part of the community, everybody has a stake in it, and there should be representatives from different parts of the community. So I guess your idea of including them in the mainstream of what, it would be including them in what kind of peace processes and what exists out there. And of course, with what President Ghani just announced in terms of the Kabul process and wanting the Taliban to come and become a political party and open an office in Afghanistan, the idea was that then they would be they would be part of the elections, that people would elect them, which is something it sounds like Taliban do want down the line. And also that they would be, stakeholders around the table in whatever kinds of negotiations that they may like, similar to what the Hizb Islami was, the kind of negotiations that were done with the Hizb Islami and that has always been touted as, well, this is an example of these violent extremists, if you want to put them that way, that were out there fighting the government, that then were brought in a peace process, and there was a negotiation, and there was an agreement to bring them in, and now they're functioning more like a political party, although there are not party politics. And I would not advocate for party politics in Afghanistan either, particularly from the perspective of women. It's not helpful. And I would say also for minority voices, it's not helpful to have the party politics because then their voices get drowned out. But the fact that they would be there as negotiators. Now, the Jamiat Islami is causing a lot of problems as a party, causing a lot of turmoil. It isn't like the Jamiat Islami is represented as a party in parliament, but because of Abdullah's role as a CEO and then all of the reach of his appointees in the government that are supporting his side of the agenda, does seem to beg the question as to whether party politics would actually work. And so if you're saying the mainstream is party politics, but we don't really have that in this, so then how can we invite the Taliban into something that isn't really functioning? That's a good question. But in terms of a peace process, there has been a peace agreement with the Hizb Islami that has been upheld that seems to be doing fine. And if we're inviting the Taliban to the table to be part of a similar peace process, that seems like there is something that's functional that we can invite the Taliban to in that circumstance. So.
I would say part of the CVE talking points that Peter was mentioning are talking about these groups. You hear a lot of people talking about these groups, and so inclusion in my mind is really including their own voice about themselves. I mean, frankly, if we want to measure impact in these spaces, what we're talking about is the transformation of ideas and figuring out if those ideas have changed, and then the transformation of behaviors and figuring out if those ideas changing have led to changed behaviors. The only way you can know what the right ideas and behaviors are to engage with to try to transform is to get as close to the place as you can where the behaviors are, frankly, empirically inappropriate violence. So to include the voice of these folks who are nonviolent but illiberal will allow you to better understand precisely what it is that they say is happening on the ground, and not folks who are several times removed from them telling you what's happening on the ground. And frankly, that's really the best way to get at functional indicators that things are happening. I mean, well, I won't, I'll leave it at that, yeah.
I guess I, like Palwasha, kind of understood the question as including exclusivist voices in solutions or processes dealing with social conflict and violence. But the way you framed the question, Kamaran, I think points to another interesting phenomenon that is relevant to this discussion, which is the sort of the idea of the disappearance of a mainstream, right? In the sense that we inhabit spaces of media information exchange that are increasingly narrowly segmented into little communities of groupthink, which means that the idea that there's a broad center space of people who, broadly speaking, think alike that can be called the mainstream, and that you would then have to have such a thing against which to define the exclusivists. That concept is sort of disappearing, which I think puts a conversation like this down a totally different rabbit hole. Your appearance in the discussion, though, reminds me, though, to let you all know that if you're interested in hearing 10 other very smart people's views on this topic, the Brookings Institution in 2015 did a series of blog posts on the question, is quietist Salafism the antidote to ISIS? So like the version of the conversation we've been having, 10 different scholars and experts, including Kamaran himself, you wrote one of the posts, right? 10 different people with a wide variety of views wrote responses to this, some pro, some con. So that's just, if you just Google quietist Salafism antidote ISIS, you'll find the whole series.
Thank you. We're at about time. There was one question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up here. So.
Hi, thank you. Excellent discussion. Michael Barr, AU alum, and also Wesley, pursuing a degree there. Curious about two things. One is, first, just easy question. How are you determining where to focus your efforts? Is it the aggregation of violence on the ground? And then the other pertains more to just the question that Peter was raising about the deep distrust or suspicion that local communities have of outside actors. And Palwasha addressed some of this with this language, and I can imagine it's much easier for maybe an NGO, perhaps, although even there they could be perceived as being used, towards the NGO's ends, but it could be harder for something like NATO, as you were mentioning, which has this particular, it's much bigger. Thanks.
All right, we'll have one of you guys or ladies or take any one of these questions.
USIP determines priority countries based on the level of conflict and opportunities that exist, and then also in terms of invitations by partners to be able to work in those spaces. So there are a number of factors that we take into account for the priority countries where we work in and where we've done work in. So that's one part of the question. The other part, well, I guess I'll leave it to the others to answer since we don't have a lot of time and now.
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar approach. It's, we look at countries, again, where there's a crossover between religious identity and violent conflict. Again, not necessarily a causal relationship. And then we look at where we have relationships that can help open that space. And we always work with local partners, so it's important for us to be able to identify a local partner that can have influence in the space as well.
I guess my inclination would be to turn your question into not just an investigation of the idea of where should we be focusing our efforts, but also the idea that we need to be judicious in our analysis of the role of the religious factor in any given conflict, right? The need to make sure that we're taking a right-sized approach to religion. Because there's a risk, I think, that, as we begin to engage with religious actors, yes, some local communities may be suspicious, but many religious actors will welcome that engagement. It makes them more important. We seem to be saying, oh, you are the ones that matter. We need your voices in this, and then I think we then run the risk of deluding ourselves into thinking that maybe the answers exist in this realm of religion, and inadvertently then overemphasize the role of religion either as a contributing factor or as a part of the solution. So, it may be surprising to hear that, but during my time at the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, I spent as much time convincing my State Department colleagues that religion was not as important as they thought it was in a given situation as trying to get them to understand the importance of religion in many situations.